Chapter 2035. What's wrong? Mrs. Shen had a bad feeling about this. She had watched Shen Luo and grow up, but she had never seen him like this. You have to tell me what's wrong, Mrs. Shen said sternly. Otherwise, I'll track your cell phone signal to find you. It's nothing. Don't ask. Rest early. Shen Luo and hung up the phone. The more Mrs. Shen thought about it, the more she felt that something was wrong. But the baby cried harder and harder, and Mrs. Shen was confused. She quickly picked him up and comforted him slowly. But the feeling of being kept in the dark was very uncomfortable. Shen Manting was seriously injured. Her left arm was fractured in 3 places, and her right leg was severely abraded. Her cheeks were also bloodstained, and the deep and shallow marks were shocking. The most serious injury was on her head. Her head was severely injured, and there was bleeding in many places. Her life was in danger. Shen Luo and almost couldn't stand when he heard the diagnosis. His hands trembled as he looked at the surgical consent letter. After signing it, he couldn't help but sit on the chair in front of the emergency room. He grabbed his hair with his blood-stained hands and cried in despair and grief. I'm sorry. A man in his 30s or 40s stood beside him and sobbed regretfully. I'm sorry, Luo An. I drank a little, and I thought there would be no one around. Shen Luo An had already lost his strength, but at this moment, he suddenly stood up when he heard this. He stared at him with bloodshot eyes and punched him hard in the face. Zhou Xinghui was in pain and took a step back. Luo An, ah. Shen Luo An strode forward and kicked him hard on the body. Zhou Xinghui was kicked to the ground. Before he could react, Shen Luo An had already straddled him, and his fists were like hail, falling heavily. Why did you drink? Why did you drive? Why didn't you look at the road? Zhou Xinghui didn't fight back, nor did he resist. After a while, his face was covered in blood. There were many people in the corridor of the emergency room, and the passing nurses exclaimed, "That's enough. Someone, pull them away." Why, Zhou Xinghui? What do I owe you? You hurt my woman like this. It was as if Shen Luo An had completely lost his mind. He attacked mercilessly. When he was pulled away, Zhou Xinghui had already fainted. The blood on his face was mixed with tears, and his face was filled with guilt. Shen Longhua was suddenly informed by the hospital staff that Shen Manting was in trouble. He rushed to the hospital in a hurry. However, she did not expect to receive news that Shen Luo An had seriously injured someone and rendered them unconscious. She rushed to the emergency room and saw Shen Luo An sitting at the door from afar. His face was expressionless as he sat at the door, as if he had lost his soul. His home clothes were stained with blood, and he was wearing slippers. Shen Longyue's heart sank. Luo An? Shen Luo An tilted his head slightly. His gray eyes were deathly still. When he saw his father, his eyes trembled and he called out, "Dad. What's wrong with Manting?" When Shen Luo An was asked this question, he suddenly felt as if his sore spot had been poked. He couldn't help but feel guilty and remorseful, and his eyes reddened. Shen Luo An had always been calm. Ever since he became sensible, she had never seen him like this. Chapter 2036. Shen Longyue's heart sank when the nurse told him about Shen Manting's condition. The nurse saw his gloomy expression and asked curiously, "Director, is the person inside your room?" Shen Longyue glanced at her and sighed softly. "My daughter-in-law." The nurse's eyes were full of sympathy and distress when she heard this. She saw the man with tears on his face at the door. There was no doubt that he was the son of the director. She comforted him and left quickly. Shen Longyue sat down beside Shen Luo An and silently sat with him. The father and son sat at the door for 10 hours. Shen Longyue and Shen Luo An kept their eyes open and staring at the door of the operating room. They didn't even yawn or take a nap. Finally, the door of the operating room opened. The chief surgeon opened the door and was stunned when he saw Shen Longyue. "Director?" Shen Luo and immediately got up and grabbed the chief surgeon's clothes. How is the person inside? Shen Longyue also came over and said, this is my son, and the woman inside is my daughter-in-law. How is she now? The chief surgeon was silent for a moment and seemed to be thinking. Then he said, she's not in good condition. Although she has received a blood transfusion, her injuries are too serious. Her limbs are broken, and she has lost blood in many parts of her brain. The patient has been in a coma for a long time. It's hard to say whether she will wake up or not. Shen Luo An's face instantly turned pale. He clutched his surgical gown tightly and shouted angrily, what do you mean? Luo An. Shen Longyue pulled him back. Listen to him first. Little Qin, has she passed the critical period? Dr. Qin shook his head and said, not for the time being. I've given her medicine, and there may be complications within 24 hours. She has to stay in the ICU for observation. If she can survive these 24 hours, she may survive. Shen Luo An was even more furious when he heard this. He roared, what do you mean by she may survive? Dr. Qin looked at him and sighed softly. Her injuries are too serious. If her vital signs can be stabilized, then she may not die. These vague and heartless words were so cruel that Shen Luo An trembled. She glared at him with bloodshot eyes and said, if she stabilizes, can she wake up? Dr. Qin was silent for a moment and looked at Shen Longyue. Director, you know. Shen Longyue's eyes were already red. He supported Shen Luo An and said in a choked voice, Luo An, go and rest first. Tell me. Shen Luo An could no longer stand. He was half collapsed and half standing. His voice was almost pleading. Stubble had appeared on his originally clean and refined face. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with blood and tears, making him look particularly miserable and ferocious. Dr. Qin couldn't bear it, but he looked at Shen Longyue and said, even if he survives, there's a high possibility that he'll become a vegetable. Shen Luo An felt as though he had been struck by lightning. His body stiffened and his mind went blank. There was a high possibility that he would end up in a vegetative state. Shen Luo An collapsed in despair and cried out, it's impossible. It's impossible. Shen Longyue was heartbroken and desperate. He pulled Shen Luo An and cried in a low voice. Shen Luo An, stand up. Chapter 2037. Shen Longyue felt a dull pain in his heart. He had high hopes for his son since he was a child. Shen Luo An was also very promising. No matter what he did it well. Shen Luo An never understood what he was thinking about when it came to love. When Guan Kui committed suicide because of him, he didn't shed a single tear. Now, Shen Manting was in trouble, and he was in this state. Shen Longyue suddenly hated Shen Manting. He hated her for not living up to his expectations. He hated her for getting hurt so badly. Looking at his son, Shen Longyue closed his eyes. Go back first. Your son is still waiting for you to come home. Shen Luo An heard that and whispered, yes, my son is still waiting for me. She took Shen Longyue's hand and was about to get up. However, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. All of a sudden, his feet slipped, and his whole body fell straight down. Shen Longyue was shocked. Luo An? When he checked again, Shen Luo An had already fainted. Shen Luo An was unconscious for a day and a night. The Shen family was in a mess. Shen Jilie and Yi Qianqian had just finished their wedding in Yuntown when they heard the bad news. When the couple hurried back to their home in the capital, they heard the cries of the baby. Mrs. Shen looked haggard. When she saw her son and daughter-in-law return, she couldn't help but cry. You're finally back. Yi Qianqian's tears fell. She rushed forward and called out, Mom. Shen Jilie saw her and didn't say a word. He reached out and took the baby. The baby had obviously cried for a long time. His voice was hoarse, and his face was pink. Coming. Nanny, he quickly came out with a bottle in her hand. When she saw Shen Jilie, she handed it to him. Feed the baby first. Mrs. Shen sat on the sofa and wailed. She hugged Yi Qianqian and couldn't stop. Yi Qianqian's heart felt like it was being corroded by thousands of ants. She gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't cry. Don't cry, Mom," although that was what she said, she cried even harder. Shenjilia didn't say a word. He carried the baby back to his room. His heart was heavy. He called Shenlongyue, and the call was quickly picked up. However, his voice sounded very tired. "Jilia. Dad." Shenjilia's expression was solemn. "Is brother awake?" "Not yet." "Where's Sister Manting?" Shenlongyue did not reply. He sighed and said, "Take good care of your mother and the baby. I'll inform you when Manting wakes up. I'll leave the baby with Qianqian. I'll go to the hospital later." "All right." Shenlongyue was exhausted. Not only was he physically tired, but he was also mentally tired. He had never been so tired before. After feeding the baby and coaxing him to sleep, Shenjilia went to Shenluo An's room. After settling him down, he gave Yi Qianqian some instructions before driving to the hospital. When she stepped into the ward, Shenluo An happened to wake up. The first thing he asked when he woke up was, "How's Manting?" "Brother, father," Shenjilia said as he walked in. "Sister Manting is fine. She has passed the critical stage and is still under observation." When Shenluo An heard this, he immediately lifted the blanket and got out of bed. "I'll go take a look." As soon as he got off the bed, he staggered. Shenjilia quickly held him up and said, "Be careful." Shenluo An's vision was a little blurry. It took him a while to stand up straight. Chapter 2038. Shenluo An's physical fitness wasn't particularly strong. He had endured for a long time yesterday and the day before, so he couldn't take it anymore. Shenjilia held him and sighed softly. "Brother, you have to take care of yourself so that you can take care of Manting." Shenluo An opened his eyes and composed himself. "I'll go and take a look." Shen Manting was in the ICU while Shenluo An looked in through the glass. His heart ached when he saw her hands and feet tied up. Her head was completely wrapped with only a white bandage that was slightly bleeding. She looked particularly pathetic. His heart felt as if it had been fiercely stabbed, and the pain was almost suffocating. When he came back to his senses, he found that tears had rolled down his face. Shenluo An's body twitched and he couldn't bear it anymore. He squatted down and cried bitterly. Shenjilia had lived to his late 20s and had grown up with Shenluo An. He had never seen him like this before. He squatted down silently and stood side by side with him. Shenjilia gently patted his shoulder and didn't make a sound. Shen Manting slept for half a month. The doctor finally confirmed that she had become a vegetable. The atmosphere in the Shen family was oppressive. 2 years wasn't long, but it wasn't short either. Since Shen Manting was lying in the hospital, Shenluo An had devoted himself to the studio. He spent the rest of his time in the studio, except for the 2 hours he spent by Shen Manting's bed with the child. "Daddy." The child stumbled into Shenluo An's arms, holding a cute fluffy toy in his hands. "Daddy, this is a gift from Grandma." Shenluo An stood up with his son in his arms and said, "Little bunny, you're so cute." Little Moon grinned and said, "Daddy, come see Mommy." Shenluo An's eyes softened and he said, "Okay, Daddy will take you to see Mommy." Little Moon was very obedient. He had just celebrated his 2nd birthday and was very intelligent. His facial features looked more and more like Shenluo An, as if they were carved from the same mold. Shenluo An drove him to the hospital. It was very quiet. It was a particularly warm winter. The hospital was a little quieter than usual after the new year. He led the little boy to Shen Manting's ward with ease. He lowered his head and said, "What did Daddy teach you? What do you have to do first when you enter the ward?" "Knock on the door." Little Moon held the bunny in his arms, clenched his fists, and knocked on the door twice. He even said, "Knock, knock." Shenluo An smirked. Then, he pushed the door open and shouted along with Little Moon, "Mom, Little Moon is here to see you." The father and son walked in, but when Shenluo and saw the hospital bed, he suddenly felt as if all the blood in his body had flowed backward to his brain. Suddenly, his mind went blank. The sickbed was empty. Suddenly, Shenluo and roared, "Where is he?" Xiao Yu was startled by her loud voice. Little Moon's mouth twitched, and he took a step back and burst into tears. Shenluo and also realized that he was overreacting. He quickly picked up the child and went outside. He roared, "Where is she? Who is looking after this ward? Where is Enchanting?" His voice was extremely loud. His voice echoed in the corridor. Soon, a nurse ran over and poked her head in to take a look. There was no one in the ward. Her heart skipped a beat and she asked, "Where is he?" Chapter 2039. The nurse shuddered and immediately said, "I'll go look for her right away." After saying that, she ran away as if she was escaping. Little Moon had stopped crying. He hugged Shenluo An's neck and asked, "Daddy, where's Mommy?" Shenluo An couldn't help panicking. His heart was beating extremely fast, and an unbearable despair was currently pressing down on his chest, causing him to almost be unable to breathe. "Daddy, don't cry." Little Moon's soft little palm brushed across Shenluo An's eyes. Shenluo An took a deep breath and coaxed him softly, "Little Moon's a good boy. Daddy will take you to Grandpa first." It wasn't far from the hospital director's office. Shenlongwe was shocked to see Shenluo An's reddened eyes. "What's wrong?" Shenluo An tried to calm himself down and said, "Daddy, look after the child. Manting is missing." Shenlongwe was shocked. What? Why would she disappear out of nowhere? Shenluo An also had the same question welling up in his heart. However, no one could answer him. "Now, we can only check the surveillance footage to see when Manting left. Daddy, I'll leave this matter to you. I'll go look for her. Even the nurse didn't find her, so she can't have gone far." Shenlongwen knew the gravity of the matter and nodded. "Okay." After receiving his confirmation, Shenluo An immediately put the child down and ran away. Little Moon was puzzled. He tilted his head and asked, "Grandpa, where did Daddy go?" Shenlongwe picked up the child and said, "Daddy went to look for Mommy." Then, he made a phone call and went to the surveillance room. Shenluo An ran hurriedly to the ward and corridor next to him. At the same time, there were many doctors and nurses looking for him. A vegetable had disappeared without anyone noticing. This matter was simply absurd to the extreme. Many people hurried around to look for him. Soon, everyone knew what had happened. After checking the surveillance footage, there was no one like Manting who had left. Shenluo An went from the first floor to the 7th floor but found nothing. Shenluo An leaned against the wall helplessly. He felt a cold touch on his back. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Found her." Shenluo An immediately became alert and ran in the direction of the voice. "Who? Found who?" "The vegetative patient in room 139 has been found." Shenluo An immediately rushed forward and saw a group of people blocking the door of a ward from afar. "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." Shenluo An pushed his way through the crowd. As soon as he entered, he heard a child crying. The child opened his mouth and cried, holding half a bun in his hand. After glancing at Shenluo An, he turned to look at the corner. In the corner, there was a woman with disheveled hair. His face was pale and his body was thin and weak. She was dressed in a loose hospital gown and was hugging her legs nervously. She raised her eyes and looked at Shenluo An. That look, that gaze. Clean and pure, like an innocent child. However, Shenluo An recognized Shenmanting at a glance. After lying in bed for 2 years, Shenmanting was as thin as a stick. But that charm, even if she were dead, he would still recognize it. Unknowingly, droplets of water were already dripping from his eyes. Shen Luo and walked over and called out softly, Manting. Chapter 2040. His voice was trembling with obvious fear. Shen Luo and was stunned. He suddenly squatted down and reached out to hold her arm. What did you say? Ah. Shen Manting's body trembled violently, and tears streamed down her face. She trembled in fear and shouted, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Uncle, let me go. I won't do it again. His voice was filled with regret and unspeakable fear. Shen Luo and felt as if his heart had been bitten by thousands of ants. He stared at her in disbelief, his heart aching. Shen Manting begged and was about to kneel down. Enough. Shen Luo and bellowed angrily. Then, he pulled her into his arms and held her firmly in his arms. Shen Manting was stunned, and her body trembled uncontrollably. Enough, enough, Shen Luo An's voice was choked with sobs, filled with endless despair. He buried his face in her neck and said in a trembling voice, It's really enough. Manting, I'm sorry. Shen Manting was stunned and didn't know what to do for a moment. She could clearly feel the warmth of the man in front of her, and the fear and nervousness in her heart immediately dissipated. For some reason, he felt a slight pain in his heart. However, he was still rational. She gently pushed him and shouted, Uncle, Shen Luo, and let go of her and looked at the blank expression on her face. He got up and said, Get up. I'll take you home. Go home. A look of fear flashed across Shen Manting's face. She pushed him away and shouted, Uncle, don't call me uncle. Shen Luo An's voice was a bit loud. But when he turned around, he saw that Shen Manting was obviously frightened. His heart ached, and his voice softened. Follow me back to the ward first. Let the doctor examine you. Shen Manting looked around. All the medical equipment was clearly displayed, and many people were wearing hospital gowns. There was also the smell of medicine and disinfectant in the air. Shen Manting suddenly panicked and burst into tears again. Am I sick again? Is Uncle Dean angry? Shen Luo and held her hand and slowly stood up. But when she heard this, she couldn't help but burst into tears. He covered his face with one hand and remained silent. Soon, he pushed his way through the crowd and walked out. Shen Manting remained quiet throughout, sobbing as she followed behind Shen Luo and Don't cry. Then, he pulled her into his arms with one hand and said, Be quiet for the examination first. Answer whatever the doctor asks you later. Do you understand? Shen Manting nodded blankly. She sniffled hard and said, Got it. Shen Luo and picked up his phone and called Shenjilia. Found it? As soon as he hung up the phone, he heard an old man's voice. Shen Manting looked over and saw a gentle and kind-looking man walking over. He was carrying a child who looked to be in his 50s or 60s. When Shen Longyue saw Shen Manting, he was shocked. Then, he swallowed hard and said, Good, you're finally awake. It was Shen Yuexiao's first time seeing Shen Manting with her eyes open. He was a little curious, so he struggled to get off the bed and asked, Mom? Shen Manting heard his voice and looked around. Then, she looked at Shen Luo and in astonishment and said, You are a woman? But. Chapter 2041. As soon as she finished speaking, the three people in the room all looked at her. A look of sorrow. A look of curiosity. A look of doubt. Shen Longyue frowned when he heard this. Luo, what's going on? Shen Luo looked at his father and shook his head blankly. She doesn't seem to recognize me. Soon, a doctor rushed over. When he saw Shen Longyue, he was stunned and called out, Director. Shen Longyue nodded and said, Give her a checkup. Yes. The medical staff quickly arrived. Please take them out. Following his instructions, they quickly left the room. After a series of examinations, the doctors came out. However, when they came out, the doctors had a strange look on their faces. She seems to have forgotten who she is. What's going on? Shinjilia hurried down. He was still wearing a white coat and was panting slightly. Is Sister Manting awake? Yes. Shen Luo and closed his eyes. That's great. It's good that she's awake. Everything else can be solved. Shinjilia breathed a sigh of relief. Her brain was severely damaged. It's normal for her to have memory problems. I'll go in and take a look. The doctor also recognized Shinjilia, so he nodded and didn't stop him. When Shinjilia went in, he saw Shen Manting trying to sneak through the window. She had already lifted one foot, but she seemed to have no strength. It was very difficult. Shinjilia was shocked and shouted, "What are you doing?" Shen Manting trembled violently and turned her head to look. When she saw Shinjilia running over, she immediately hugged the window railing and shouted, "Ah! No, don't pull me. I don't have money to pay for the medical fees. Just let me jump off the building and die." Shinjilia was stunned. Without another word, he pulled her down from the chair. Shen Manting's body was as light as a swallow. He could directly pull her up with one hand. Shen Manting's face was sad and she struggled with her hands and feet. When she found that she couldn't move, she actually hugged Shinjilia's thigh. Shinjilia was shocked. Before he could react, he heard a loud roar coming from below. Sob, 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 "Uncle, I don't have money. Don't check me anymore. I'm an orphan. I don't have money. The orphanage is going to collapse. If Uncle Director knows that I've been checked so many times in the hospital, he'll definitely kill me. Please don't check me anymore." Shinjilia didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard that. When she turned around, Shen Luo and Shen Longyue had already walked in. Shen Luo An's face darkened when he saw what she was doing. He quickly stepped forward and pulled her away. But Shen Manting seemed to be possessed. She clung to Shinjilia's thigh tightly and cried out, "Uncle, don't pull me. I don't have money to pay for the medical fees even if you pull me. I'll pay you back when I grow up. Don't go looking for Uncle Director. He'll kill me." When Shen Luo heard this, his arms trembled even more. He gritted his teeth and shouted, "Shen Manting, stand up, or else I'll make you pay the medical fees yourself." Shen Manting suddenly stopped crying and looked at Shen Luo. She sobbed and said, "Are you talking to me? Is there anyone else called Shen Manting here besides you?" Shen Manting immediately stood up, but her body was weak and she almost fell down again. Shen Luo reacted quickly and held her in his arms. Shen Manting was 168 centimeters, and Shen Luo was 180 centimeters. When she stood up, her forehead was just close to his chin. Chapter 2042. As soon as she said that, Shinjilia burst into laughter. Shen Luo An's face darkened. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifted her up, and put her on the hospital bed. He looked at Shen Manting for a while and couldn't help but say, "Because I'm your man." "Ah." Shen Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open. "What?" Shinjilia quickly pulled Shen Luo and said, "Brother, don't scare her. Leave it to me. You can go out first." "No." Shen Luo took a stool and sat down. "You do what you need to do. I'll sit here." "How can we do that?" Shinjilia frowned, but when he saw the unhappy look on his father's face, he couldn't help but cough softly and curl his lips. "In that case, Dad, please take care of Little Moon for a while." Shen Longyue knew the gravity of the situation. He nodded and said, "Little Moon, let's go." Shen Yueshao didn't comply. He looked at Shen Manting with his big black eyes and said, "Mom." Shen Manting finally saw it clearly. She was shocked and exclaimed, "No way. Is she calling me mommy? When did I have such a big son?" Shen Longyue's heart ached when he heard this. He glanced at Shen Manting and sighed. "Let's go, Little Moon. Come back to see Mom later." "Okay." Shen Yueshao was reluctant to leave. Mom, little Moon will come back to see you tomorrow. Shen Manting heard a childish voice. Shen Manting listened to it and found it familiar. She seemed to hear this sentence every day. She felt a dull pain in her heart. Suddenly, she felt as if she had seen a ghost. She looked at the two men in front of her and sat quietly. Shen Luo and picked up his recording pen and turned it on. He said, "From now on, I'll ask you a question and you'll answer it. Tell me everything you know and the truth. Do you understand?" "Okay." Shen Manting looked at Shen Luo and then at Shinjilia. She said, "Uncle, will your brother really pay for my medical expenses?" When Shinjilia heard this, he chuckled. "How did you know he was my brother?" "You called him brother just now, and you called the grandfather just now dad. Also, you look a little similar, which means that you are biological brothers, the sons of the grandfather just now." She then rubbed her stomach and said, "I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry that I don't have any strength left in me." Shinjilia felt relieved. At the very least, his IQ wasn't low. Shinjilia took a few notes in his notebook and said, "I'll get you something to eat later. Answer the question first." "Oh. How old are you?" 12 years old. "A 12-year-old calls me uncle. Do I look that old?" Shen Luo asked suddenly. Shinjilia almost burst out laughing. It seemed that Shen Luo was very bothered by the way she addressed him as uncle. However, he immediately coughed lightly and said, "Brother, please keep quiet." Shen Luo immediately fell silent. Shen Manting said, "You look like you're in your 30s. Although you're not particularly old, you're much older than me." Yes, this was the 12-year-old Shen Manting. Shinjilia made a few notes in the notebook and asked, "Do you remember what you were doing before you passed out?" "Of course I remember." Shen Manting looked a little sad and said without hesitation, "The director asked me to help him buy soy sauce and go back to cook. But when I went back, I tripped and the soy sauce bottle broke. I was beaten by the director's aunt. When I woke up, I was in the hospital." Shinjilia frowned and looked up. He asked, "Do you remember what your name is?" "He Yun Suan." "How do you write it?" Chapter 2043. Shinjilia and Shen Luo both looked at her. Shen Manting shrank back under their stares and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong? Have you always been called this name?" Shinjilia asked. As he spoke, he looked at Shen Manting's expression and added, "Tell me the truth." Shen Manting frowned when she heard this and said, "This is my name, not Shen Manting. When I was young, I was abandoned on the street. They didn't even give me a birthday card. Later, an old man who picked up garbage sent me to an orphanage." Shen Luo was silent. Shinjilia nodded and asked, "And then?" "Then the old man said that since he didn't raise me, why did he give birth to me? So, the director gave me this name. He Yun Suan. She gave a child such a name. Why did she allow it to exist?" Shen Luo felt a little pain in his heart. He realized that he knew nothing about her. "Do you know Zhang Meifang?" Shinjilia recorded in his notebook and looked up at Shen Manting. "Yes," Shen Manting nodded. "She's my good friend, but the director likes her very much. She's beautiful and sensible." Shinjilia and Shen Luo looked at each other. They both saw a trace of doubt in each other's eyes. "What's wrong?" Shen Manting looked at them and suddenly looked a little sad. She asked in a low voice, "Did you find the wrong person? Is the person you're looking for actually Meifang?" "No, we're looking for you." Shinjilia tapped the back of his hand with the pen and said slowly, "Have you seen me?" "No." "Have you seen him?" "No." "What do you usually like to eat?" Shen Manting exclaimed. When she heard this, she covered her growling stomach and said, "I'm actually not picky. I eat anything." Shen Luo suddenly asked, "Do you eat onions?" "Ah." Shen Manting's face immediately fell. "No." "Do you eat coriander?" "No," Shen Luo smiled lightly. "Then why did you say you eat anything?" Shen Manting was speechless. He asked a few more questions. Shen Manting did not hesitate and readily followed his advice. But when she asked about Shen Manting, there was an obvious look of doubt on her face. Who is Shen Yuexiao? Who is Shen Luoan? Who is Shen Jilia? I don't know anyone. All right, Shen Jilia said as he put the notebook away. I have a general understanding of the situation. Now, I have something to tell you. Don't be too shocked. What? Shen Manting looked at him curiously with an innocent look on her face. She was completely different from the usual Shen Manting. Shen Jilia paused for a moment, then stood up and said, "Give me a moment." After walking out for a few minutes, he came back with a mirror in his hand. He handed it to Shen Manting and said, "Take a look at yourself." When Shen Manting saw this, she was baffled. He took it and looked at it. He turned pale with fright. Ah! Shen Manting flung the mirror away and asked in horror, "Who is this?" This kind of reaction was a little too big. Shen Luo and didn't expect this and couldn't sit still. He picked up the mirror and said, "This is Shen Manting. She's my sister-in-law and the mother of my nephew. She's 31 years old and lives in the capital. She's been an orphan since she was young." Chapter 2044. However, as soon as Shen Manting finished speaking, she found that the eyes of the two men in front of her remained unchanged. Shen Manting was shocked and suddenly felt a little like crying. She pursed her lips and burst into tears. "You're lying to me. I haven't aged. This isn't me at all. I'm only 12 years old." Shen Jilia glanced at Shen Luo and sighed softly. "Brother, we can't go on like this." Shen Luo and also had a headache and said, "You go ahead. Leave it to me. I'm afraid that you can't handle it." She seems to have lost her memory from the age of 12 to 29. It's a whole 17 years. You. Shen Manting had a bad feeling and looked at them. "Didn't you say that I was 31 years old?" "Yes." Shen Jilia looked at her with a little sympathy in his eyes. "You had a car accident when you were 29. Your hands and feet were broken, and your head was severely injured. You've been lying in bed for 2 years. What? What?" Shen Manting couldn't believe it. "You mean I've been in the hospital for 2 years? How much money is that?" Shen Jilia was speechless. She turned around and patted Shen Luo on the shoulder. "Communicate well and guide her. I'll go ahead." "Okay." Shen Luo responded. His eyes calmly fell on Shen Manting. He slowly said, "You're the mother of my child. It's my duty to take care of you." "What?" Shen Manting felt dizzy. "I haven't grown up and I'm not married. How could I have a child? Unfortunately, you did." Shen Luo walked over and poured her a glass of water. "What do you want for dinner?" Shen Manting immediately straightened up. "So, you're my husband. I want to have a big meal. Is that okay?" "Husband," Shen Luo was caught off guard. The words suddenly rippled in his heart. He looked at her with his amber eyes and said slowly, "Yes." Shen Manting suddenly became excited and said, "Then, husband, I want to have a big meal. The kind that needs to be cut with a knife and fork." Her eyes were dark and bright, pure and clean, with expectation and desire. Shen Luo's heart ached. He handed the water to her and said, "Drink some water first." "Oh." Shen Manting took the water from him and gulped it down. "Are we going to have a feast?" she asked. "Not yet." Shen Manting was disappointed. "What? It's all a lie. You made me call you hubby. Give it back to me." He explained, "You've just woken up, so your body can't handle it yet. When you're better, I'll take you to whatever you want to eat." "Really?" Shen Manting looked at him expectantly. "You promised." "Yes, I will." Shen Luo nodded. "I'll ask my family to prepare a nutritious meal for you." "Sure." Shen Manting's eyes sparkled. He was secretly delighted. It seemed like it was pretty good. This uncle looked quite handsome, nice, and had a good personality. The most important thing was that she didn't have to be scolded by Uncle Dean, and she didn't have to deal with the people in the orphanage. She rolled her eyes and looked at Shen Luo. Then, hubby, can I ask you a question? Hubby, it was another word that caught him off guard. Shen Luo straightened up and answered in a low voice, yes. We've already given birth to a child. Have we kissed? Shen Luo looked at her again, perhaps because such a question was too childish. Chapter 2045. Shen Luo glanced at her a few more times because her question was too childish. Shen Manting shrank back and whispered, I swore that my first kiss would be reserved for my Prince Charming. Her silly and cute words made the soft part of Shen Luo restless for a moment. He moved an inch and leaned toward her. Shen Manting subconsciously shrank back, but in the next moment, Shen Luo had already reached out and clamped her chin, accurately capturing her lips. The soft and smooth touch was immediately transmitted from his lips. Shen Manting's eyes widened, but soon she closed them again. Shen Luo had never felt like this before. It turned out that Shen Manting would be so obedient when he kissed her. He couldn't help but ask for more. He gently pried open her lips and teeth, captured her softness, and slowly invaded. After an unknown period of time, Shen Manting couldn't stand it anymore. She gently pushed him away, and Shen Luo released her. Shen Manting immediately panted, and her cheeks were a little red. She looked at him shyly. Shen Luo was even more confused. He couldn't help but move closer and look at her deeply. Shen Manting shrank back, then lay on the bed and covered her head with the quilt. Her voice came from under the quilt, and it was a little muffled. Honey, I don't want to have children anymore. After she had a big meal, she would consider whether to continue kissing her biological child. However, she was so hungry now. Kissing shouldn't make her pregnant, right? Shen Manting was a little uncertain. She lifted the quilt and revealed one eye. At a glance, she saw Shen Luo standing. Shen Luo looked at her with a deep gaze. He was a little sad and glad. Shen Manting suddenly felt that he was very pitiful. She whispered, Honey, are you very sad? When Shen Luo heard this, he suddenly smiled and said, No. Then why do you look so sad? Shen Manting looked at him with a little guilt and apology. She whispered, But I still want to say, don't kiss me in the future. What if I get pregnant? I don't want to have children. I heard that giving birth is very painful. Very painful. It can even kill people. Shen Manting thought of this and shrank back. When Shen Luo heard this, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Who told you that kissing will make you pregnant? Shen Manting's face was burning with embarrassment. She covered her face with the blanket in embarrassment and whispered, That's what everyone says, Shen Luo, and let out a rare laugh. He moved closer and whispered, I won't, but I'm your Prince Charming. Our child is already 2 years old. You have to call me hubby from now on. Do you understand? Perhaps it was because Shen Luo was so close to her that she felt her heart warm up. Her face was also hot. She nodded and said, Yes, I know, hubby. Shen Luo's heart softened, and tears welled up in his eyes. He turned around and said, I'll make the call. Shen Manting looked at his back and suddenly felt a little sad. This feeling came out of nowhere. It was a little scary, but at the same time, there was satisfaction and excitement. This feeling seemed to be instinctive. Even she herself did not know what she was sad about, excited about, or satisfied about. He stayed in the hospital for 3 days. After 3 days, when the doctors confirmed that she was physically and mentally fit to be discharged, Shen Manting returned to the so-called home. It was a beautiful and luxurious house. She had never seen such a big and beautiful house. Mom. Chapter 2046. Shen Manting was a little frightened. It wasn't that she hadn't seen this child in the past few days, but it was still very difficult for her to accept that such a large meatball had actually popped out from her stomach. She looked at him and squatted down. Shen Yueshao also looked at her. The mother and son looked at each other for a long time. The little fellow stretched out his arms and shouted, "Mommy, hug me." Shen Manting's heart suddenly softened. Her lips unconsciously curled into a smile, and she reached out to hug him. Manting is back. Nanny He's eyes were slightly red. "I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're back." Shen Manting blinked her eyes in confusion. Shen Luo and reminded her, "This is Nanny He." "Hello, Nanny He." Shen Manting greeted her obediently and quickly followed Shen Luo and into the room with the infant in her arms. "This is our room." Shen Luo and stood up straight and pointed to a small bed inside. "The baby sleeps there." Shen Manting nodded. "Are we going to sleep here?" As he spoke, he walked over and looked at the big bed. But when she turned around, she saw Shen Luo and slightly strange expression. Shen Manting thought she had said something wrong. She hugged the baby and shrank her head. She whispered, "Aren't Daddy and Mommy supposed to sleep together?" She didn't have parents, but the parents of other children slept in the same room, on the same bed. Shen Luo An's eyes softened. He nodded slightly. "Yes." Shen Manting breathed a sigh of relief. She sat down with the baby in her arms and said, "What a big bed. I've never slept in such a big bed before. Wow, it's so bouncy and comfortable." "Manting, you're back." An old man's voice rang out. Shen Manting felt a sense of familiarity when she heard it. She put the baby down, stood up, and walked out. When she saw the old woman walking toward her, she greeted, "Grandma." "Eh." Old Mrs. Shen immediately rushed forward and hugged Shen Manting with reddened eyes. "It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back. You're finally out of the hospital. Let Luo and take you out for a walk." "Yeah." Shen Manting smiled slyly and said, "Hubby said he's taking me out for a feast today." "Hubby?" Nanny He couldn't help turning around to take a second look at the way she addressed him. The others had already seen how thorough Shen Manting's amnesia was, so they were not surprised by it. Old Mrs. Shen nodded and said, "All right, go ahead then. Luo and take good care of Manting." "Okay." Shen Luo and chuckled. "I won't be bringing little Moon along. Just watch." "Okay." Old Mrs. Shen's eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. Manting was finally as obedient as she was now. Of course, he had to create more opportunities for them to be alone together. He took Shen Manting for a stroll around the neighborhood of the house. Everything he saw was new and interesting. She didn't reject Shen Luo and holding her hand. His palm was soft and warm. She was just too skinny. "Let's go." "Okay." Shen Manting agreed happily and got into his car. "Hubby, will it be just the two of us?" "Yes." Shen Luo and glanced at her, his eyes full of tenderness. "This is called a world of the two of us." Shen Manting blushed when she heard that. She asked in a low voice, "Are we going on a date?" Shen Luo and chuckled. He leaned over and said, "Yes, come closer." Chapter 2047. Shen Luo An's heart warmed when he saw her pouting little mouth in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and gently kissed her lips. He gently held her in his arms and felt her obviously too thin body. His heart ached a little. He reached out and pulled the seat belt behind her. He let go of her and said, "I'll take you to eat your favorite food." Shen Manting's cheeks were red and she was very happy. She nodded and looked at Shen Luo, and with a pair of shining eyes. She said sincerely, "Honey, you're so nice. Honey, you're so nice." It was impossible for Shen Manting to utter those words, but she could hear them clearly from the side. Shen Luo An's hands trembled slightly when he buckled her seatbelt. If she knew how much she used to hate him, would she still say such words? Would she still say good things about him? Would she still call him husband? There was no doubt about the answer. But soon, it returned to normal. Let's go. Okay. The car drove steadily to the Western restaurant that Enchanting used to like to go to in the past. He ordered her favorite dishes. Enchanting looked around curiously, as if she had never seen it before. She leaned forward and whispered, "Honey, is our family very rich?" Shen Luo chuckled. "Why do you ask? One look and you can tell that this is a very expensive place. I just looked at the menu and it costs more than $500 for a steak. It's so expensive. When I was obedient, Uncle Dean only gave me 10 cents to buy candy." Enchanting felt a little wronged as she spoke. But soon, she covered her mouth and said timidly, "Honey, am I too childish?" Shen Luo felt a slight pain in his heart and looked at her sadly. He shook his head against his will and said, "No, it's very good." Enchanting vaguely felt that he was lying. But she didn't expose him. Nodding his head, he quietly sat up straight and still. Soon, the dishes were served. There was only one steak on a very fragrant and high-end plate. Enchanting opened her eyes wide but didn't say anything. After the waiter left, she said, "Honey, it's even more beautiful than what I saw on TV." Shen Luo chuckled and picked up the knife and fork. "Come on, I'll teach you how to cut it." "Yes." Enchanting beamed. She looked at Shen Luo's expression and demonstrated it to him, and he quickly followed her advice. Just like, she knew how to use it. After a hearty meal, Shen Luo and Enchanting went shopping. He bought a lot of clothes. Enchanting was too thin now. After choosing 2 sets of clothes, she tugged at Shen Luo and said, "Honey, I've just woken up. The smallest one is already too big for me. Don't buy it now. I'll buy it again when I gain some weight." Shen Luo nodded with a smile. Returning home was a rewarding journey. Shen Yueshao had already fallen asleep. Shen Luo and Enchanting crept into the room quietly. "Go take a shower first. I'll get you your pajamas," Shen Luo said. "Okay." Enchanting didn't dare to speak too loudly and quickly walked into the bathroom. However, he was dazzled by the spacious bathroom and exclaimed, "It's too big." Shen Luo was holding her pajamas. When he heard this, he smiled and asked, "Do you know how to shower?" Enchanting looked at him as if he was retarded. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She took the pajamas and pushed him out. "Don't peek at me." The smile on Shen Luo's face widened. He nodded with a smile and said, "I'll wait for you." Enchanting's face turned red. Chapter 2048. Her heart was beating fast. Enchanting was in a good mood. She hummed a tune, took off her clothes, and entered the shower room. She turned on the water and tested the temperature before she suddenly realized that something was wrong. When she was in the orphanage, she used to boil water for bathing. Why did she know how to use such an advanced thing here? Enchanting suddenly felt a little excited and muttered, "It seems that I'm really a genius." While she was happily bathing, she touched her small chest. The bulge seemed so big. She couldn't hold it with one hand. She was so thin, how did it grow? After bathing awkwardly, she found that her body was different everywhere. After a while, Enchanting put on clean pajamas and walked out. Her wet hair was wrapped up. Shen Luo didn't know what he was doing. When he saw her come out, he seemed to hide something under the quilt. Enchanting blushed and shouted, "Honey, what are you doing?" "Nothing." Shen Luo stood up. "Dry your hair. Don't catch a cold." "I won't." Enchanting waved her arm. "There's a heater in the room. It's not cold. Sit down." "Okay." Enchanting sat on the bed and couldn't help but look under the quilt curiously. Shen Luo noticed her little movement, but he pretended not to see it. He removed the towel from her head and slowly dried her hair. The heater in the room was on, and soon her hair was half dry. Shen Luo and quickly went to take a shower, and Shenmanting immediately reached out to the quilt. She felt a small box. The box was made of black velvet and felt smooth and comfortable. She opened the box, and inside was a ring. It was a big, shiny diamond in the shape of a heart. Shenmanting's eyes lit up. She couldn't help but pick it up and put it on her finger. Almost automatically, she put it on the ring finger of her left hand. There was no flesh on her finger, so it was easy to put on. It was very loose and dangled on her finger. But for some reason, she suddenly felt an unknown place in her heart began to ache. She suddenly felt a little sad. She stared at the ring, and her eyes were a little hot. An urge to cry was difficult to suppress. It came crazily, but inexplicably. He quietly put the ring back and continued to stuff it under the blanket, pretending that he had not touched it at all. But when she fell onto the bed, she couldn't help but burst into tears. She whimpered softly, her heart was empty, very empty. When Shen Luo came out, Shenmanting was already asleep on the bed. The position was in the middle. The lights were still on, very bright. However, she was sleeping soundly. Her even breathing could be heard, almost in sync with her son's. He walked up quietly and subconsciously touched the ring he had just placed on the table. It's still there. He was a little disappointed, but he quickly placed the ring in the drawer of the bedside table. He turned off the lights and lay down. There was a faint sense of satisfaction and joy in his heart. He reached out and gently pulled her into his embrace. Shenmanting was asleep. When she sensed his breath, she couldn't help but lean forward and reach out to grab his clothes. Honey, I feel so sad. Shen Luo's body stiffened. He placed his hand on her cheek and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Chapter 2049. Shen Luo's body stiffened when he heard this. His heart ached and he looked down at her face. The room was dark, but he could still clearly feel the tears on Shenmanting's face. She was different from before. She was different at all. In the past, Shenmanting would cry with a smile. It was ugly and cruel. But now, she was crying. She was just crying. She was different. She was different. Shen Luo silently pulled her into his arms and hugged her tightly. Shenmanting subconsciously leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. She rubbed against his chest. His body smelled faintly of shampoo. It was warm. Shen Luo gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't think about anything. Go to sleep." "Okay." Shenmanting closed her eyes and soon fell into a deep sleep. Shen Luo hugged her and his heart ached. He closed his eyes, but his mind was in a mess and he couldn't sleep. Early morning. Shenmanting's body ached from sleeping and she stretched. But when she turned around, she saw Shen Luo looking at her. His amber eyes were clear and quiet. Shenmanting was startled and her body twitched. Then, she shrank back and her cheeks were a little hot. "Good morning, honey." Shen Luo smiled and said, "Good morning." Shenmanting immediately got up and went to the bathroom. She closed the door and was in a good mood. After washing up, she walked out and saw Shen Luo dressing the child. Shen Yueshao saw Shenmanting coming out and called out with a smile, "Mom." Shenmanting walked over and touched the little boy's head. "Good boy." The little boy was a little happy. He opened his arms and rubbed them in Shenmanting's direction. "Give me a hug." Shenmanting squatted down and picked up the little boy. "Let's go. Mom will take you to dinner." "Okay." Shen Yueshao was very happy and hugged Shenmanting's neck. Shen Luo smiled with relief when he saw it, but then he reminded her, "You haven't brushed your teeth yet. Help little Moon brush his teeth first." Shenmanting was shocked. "He's so young and he's already brushing his teeth." "Of course you have to brush your teeth. It won't hurt so much when you're changing your teeth." Shen Luo tapped her nose. "You have to instill good education and habits in your child." "Oh." Shen Manting held the baby in her arms. Let's go then. Does he know how to do it? Yes. Little Moon had already spoken up. Mommy, I can brush my teeth. Shen Manting couldn't help but exclaim, he's indeed a doctor's child. She carried him into the bathroom and said, let's go. From today onwards, she would learn to be a good mother. Be a good mother. No matter what, she must have given birth to this child. Otherwise, how could he look so much like her? Moreover, he was adorable no matter how she looked at him. She could get a son without having to suffer any pain. It was worth it. But just as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the child's voice. P. Shen Manting froze and looked at him. Little Moon pouted and said, Mommy, pee. She looked at Shen Luo and said, Dear, the baby wants to pee. Shen Luo chuckled when he saw her pleading look. He took the baby from her arms and said, Go and have breakfast first. I'll clean up for your baby. Okay, Shen Manting replied and turned around. She felt sweet inside and said, I'll wait for you. Chapter 2050. When Shen Manting walked out, the whole family was already outside. A young woman was sitting next to Shenjilia. She looked very lively and beautiful. When she saw Shen Manting, her eyes lit up and she exclaimed, Manting. Shen Manting was a little flattered. She stepped back and said, I'm Yi Qianqian, Qianqian. Yi Qianqian pointed to herself and then to Shenjilia. Shenjilia's wife. As she spoke, she hugged Shen Manting excitedly. You're finally awake. That's great. Yi Qianqian's eyes were a little red. She patted her back and said in a choked voice, Everything will be fine. Shen Manting suddenly didn't know how to react. She laughed and said, Cece, I'm hungry. Oh. Yi Qianqian immediately released her and smiled happily. Well, let's eat together. Yi Qianqian held Shen Manting's hand and walked to the table. Shen Manting looked around and called out, Dad, Mom, Grandma. The people who were called all smiled. Mrs. Shen smiled and said, Don't be so formal at home. Well, eat more. Look at how thin you are. Old Mrs. Shen's heart ached for her. She handed her a bowl and asked, When will your body be as fair and plump as it used to be? Shen Manting glanced at her body. Fair and plump? She had never experienced what it felt like to be fair and plump. So, she had been fair and plump before? Shen Manting sat down and nodded. She was a little touched. When they were halfway through eating, Shen Luo came out with his son. Little Moon was bouncing up and down. When he saw Shen Manting, he called out, Mom. Shen Manting's eyes softened and she nodded. Shen Luo carried him to the dining table and sat down. He said, Who else hasn't been called? Grandpa, Grandma. After greeting Grandpa and Grandma in a childish voice, his eyes fell on old Mrs. Shen. He blinked and called out, Grandma. Shen Luo chuckled and pinched his little face. He corrected, Great-Grandma. Take Grandma. He shouted loudly, but it wasn't accurate. Everyone laughed. Old Mrs. Shen smiled and gave him a cup of soy milk. Say it again. Take Grandma. Yi Qianqian couldn't stop laughing and asked, What about me? What about me? Little Moon tilted his head and thought for a moment, but he still didn't know what to say. He looked at Shen Luo for help. Daddy, Shen Luo chuckled and greeted, Aunt. Little Moon called out softly, Sen. Auntie, Yi Qianqian corrected her. Lift your tongue, Auntie. Little Moon looked a little helpless, as if he knew that he had called out the wrong name. He shrunk his head and whispered, Sen. Yi Qianqian gave up and gave him a small bun. Be good. Xiao Yu took it from her and beamed with joy. Shen Luo bowed his head and said, Thank you, Aunt. Xia Sen. The whole family couldn't help but laugh. Shenjilia finally walked over and chuckled helplessly. Calling mom and dad is quite smooth, but calling anyone else is no good. Uncle. Little Moon looked at Shinjilia excitedly and called out to him. Shinjilia laughed and said, "You're smart." Little Moon knew that he had been praised and swung his legs happily. Our Little Moon can talk about other things, Shinluo, and sat beside him and said, "What do you want to say to mommy?" Little Moon smiled and pointed at Shinluo and then, he shouted, "Mommy, Little Moon is here to see you." Chapter 2051. It was a very familiar sentence. It was as if she had heard it countless times when she was asleep. After the young child finished speaking, he laughed happily. He took a bite of the little bun in his hand and smiled happily. She felt a lump in her throat and had the urge to cry. Shinluo and seemed to notice Shinmanting's gaze and looked at her. His eyes were a little soft, and he looked at her with a smile on his face. After breakfast, Shinluo and handed the baby to Yi Qianqian. After getting her full assurance, he led Shinmanting out. Shinmanting sat in the driver's seat. This time, she had learned to be smart. She buckled her seatbelt and looked at Shinluo and, "Honey, where are we going today?" "To the orphanage." Shinluo and glanced at her. "Back to the orphanage." Shinmanting opened her eyes wide and said, "Are we going to the orphanage?" "Yes." Shinmanting was a little scared after getting a positive answer. She slid her hand on the seatbelt and asked, "Why are we going back?" "To find your good friend." Shinluo and looked at her. "Do you remember what you told me your name?" Shinmanting felt a little strange when she heard this. After thinking for a while, she said, "He Yunsuan." "Was that your name when you were in the orphanage?" Shinmanting nodded and looked at the expression on Shinluo An's face. She felt a little scared and asked, "What's wrong?" "What about Zhang Meifang?" "She is my good friend." Shinmanting was very sure. "Honey, you have asked this question twice. The last time was in the ward a few days ago." He and Shinjilie were asking this question. When it came to this question, both of their expressions didn't look too good. They were indescribably solemn. Could it be that there was a problem? Shinmanting looked at him, but Shinluo and didn't say anything. He said, "Sit tight." "Okay." Shinmanting was already seated. "I'm ready." Shinluo and glanced at her, started the car, and sped away. By the time they arrived at the orphanage, almost an hour had passed. During this hour, Shinmanting looked out of the window and played with her phone from time to time. He stopped the car and turned off the GPS. "We're here," he said. Shinmanting looked up and exclaimed, "Hubby, why has this place become so run down? It's been 19 years. Of course it will change." Shinluo and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Let's go." When Shinmanting got out of the car, the sun was blazing. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the two children sitting at the door. The two children looked to be only 5 or 6 years old. When they saw Shinluo An's car, their eyes lit up in surprise. Shinmanting felt a little sour in her heart. Finally, I'm not the one looking at other people's cars. Now these children are also looking at my car. Humph. She caught up with him, held his arm, and asked, "Hubby, is the director still around?" Shinluo An asked. "Is the director still around?" "Yes." Shinluo An glanced at her. "Do you remember which room it was?" Shinmanting nodded and pulled Shinluo An into the yard. The children were running around and playing games. Seeing these two strangers dressed so well, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. "Director!" Shinmanting shouted. "Is the director around?" Chapter 2052. Are you the dean? Shinmanting looked at the man in front of her, who was about the same age as Shinluo An, and was surprised. The man looked at her and said, "The dean is resting at the moment." "Why are you looking for him?" Shinmanting breathed a sigh of relief and said, "I used to live here, and now I'm back to look for him." "Oh." The man looked at Shinmanting and said, "Who are you? Why do you look so familiar?" However, he was too thin. He looked so thin that he was out of shape. She couldn't recognize him at all. When Enchanting heard this, she smiled and said, "Do you know me? I'm He Yunsuan." The man looked at her in surprise and said, "Yunsuan? Really? Why are you? Why is he so thin?" Yes, Enchanting looked as usual, then glanced at Shenluo and took his arm and said, "This is my husband, Shenluo and he's a scientist." The man was even more surprised. "A scientist?" "No," Shenluo and pressed Enchanting's hand. "I'm just researching some medicine." "Is the old dean here?" "Oh, he's sleeping. The old man hasn't been in good health recently." The man kept glancing at Enchanting as he spoke and said, "Yunsuan has become so big. Time flies. Do you still remember who I am?" "Who?" Enchanting looked at him with her eyes wide open and frowned. She vaguely felt that he was a little familiar, but the difference from when he was a child was too big. Enchanting couldn't recognize who he was at all. The man laughed and said, "Don't you remember me? I'm He Junsheng." "He Junsheng?" Enchanting covered her mouth. "No way, how is it possible?" He Junsheng touched his head with a little embarrassment. "Yes, I've changed a little. Come on in and sit down." Enchanting's face was still full of disbelief when she led the two in. "Isn't He Junsheng the silly little brother from before? You look so smart now." Enchanting's memory stopped at the age of 12, so she didn't have many words in her mind. What he said at this moment was the truth of the heavens. He Junsheng felt even more embarrassed and said, Yes." Shenluo An's lips curved into a smile. He pressed Enchanting down and said, "She got into a car accident 2 years ago and was hospitalized for 2 years. She has some memory problems and can only remember things from before she was 12 years old." He Junsheng was stunned for a moment, then he looked at Enchanting with understanding in his eyes. He looked at her sympathetically and said, "Yunsuan is a very smart person. The headmaster likes him very much. I'll go see if the headmaster has woken up." "Wait a minute," Shenluo and stopped him. "Since you grew up with her, you should know a lot about her. Let's talk first." He Junsheng looked at Enchanting and nodded. "Have a seat. I'll make you some tea." Shenluo and was indeed a little thirsty, so he didn't refuse. Enchanting made herself at home and pulled Shenluo and to sit on the bone stool. The decoration of the house was very old, and the furniture seemed to be from more than 10 years ago. Enchanting looked around and suddenly stood up. She said, "Hubby, Meifang and I drew a butterfly here. Come and take a look." Shenluo and stood up and walked over. Sure enough, he saw the shallow marks. There were 2 butterflies, one crooked and the other dancing. There was a signature at the bottom, and it was written Zhang Meifang at the bottom. On the butterfly that looked slightly better, it was written He Yunsuan. There was also a smiling face at the bottom. The marks were very shallow, and it was obvious that a long time had passed. The orphanage was not big, and the decoration was very old. Shenluo and looked around and saw that He Junsheng had already brought the tea set. Shenluo and pulled Enchanting back to sit down. He Junsheng smiled and said, "It's been a long time since we had a guest." The tea set was left for a while, and it was just washed. After boiling the water, He Junsheng looked at Enchanting and said, "She just woke up, didn't she? She's too thin." "Yes, she woke up a few days ago." Shenluo and looked at him. "But, are you sure she's He Yunsuan?" "Yes," He Junsheng looked at her. "She's witty and clever. She's obviously powerful. Who else could it be if not Yunsuan?" "Then, what about Zhang Meifang?" Shenluo and asked. At the mention of this name, He Junsheng was quite emotional. Meifang is quiet and seems to be quiet. She's not very smart. Compared to Yunsuan, she's far behind. Where is she? She disappeared when she was a teenager. I don't know where she went. At that time, I called the police and looked for the surveillance cameras, but they couldn't find her anywhere. He Junsheng disinfected the tea set when the water was boiling. It's a pity. Meifang is kind and good-looking. Back then, my grandmother came to adopt her. Shen Luo and looked at him. At that time, she found someone based on her horoscope, and the person she adopted was Zhang Meifang. He Junsheng's teacup trembled, and the cup fell. The boiling water splashed and sprayed Shen Manting's fingers. Shen Manting shrank her hand in pain and hurriedly covered it. Shen Luo and was shocked. He pulled her hand over and quickly checked it. Are you okay? I'm fine. Shen Manting was a little embarrassed. She pushed his hand away and looked at He Junsheng. Junsheng, can't you find Meifang now? He Junsheng suddenly looked a little flustered and said, Who's here? A slightly old voice was heard. An old man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s walked over. Shen Manting recognized him at a glance. Uncle Dean. She stood up and walked over to him to help him. When Uncle Dean saw Shen Manting, he was stunned. You are Yun Suan. Shen Manting said her name without any hesitation. The moment she said it, the look on the dean's face changed a little. He subconsciously glanced at Shen Luo and asked, Who is this? My husband. Shen Manting smiled and helped the old man to sit down beside the chair. Long time no see. Yes, long time no see. The dean smiled, but he looked a little uncomfortable. I haven't been here for a long time. You're here for, Dean, I want to know where Zhang Meifang is. The dean's expression changed. Zhang Meifang, He Junsheng looked at him and frowned. Dean, it's okay. Meifang. Meifang was adopted. The dean felt a little guilty. She hasn't been back for many years. Didn't she get lost? Shen Luo asked. Mr. He just said that Zhang Meifang got lost when she was a teenager. Moreover, you said that she was adopted. When she became an adult, she was adopted by our family again. What's going on? The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifang. Chapter 2053. The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifang. In the end, they adopted He Yunsuan instead. Grandma would never lie to her family, so there was only one explanation: Grandma had been deceived. According to He Junsheng, Zhang Meifang had long been lost. In the end, when Grandma went to look for her, the orphanage replaced Zhang Meifang with He Yunsuan. Why did they do that? The director was sweating profusely when he heard this. He panicked and said, My name is Shen Luo. Shen Luo took out his business card. The director held the white business card in his hand and couldn't help but feel nervous. My grandmother adopted a girl named Zhang Meifang from this orphanage. As Shen Luo spoke, he paid close attention to the director's expression. My grandmother firmly believed that she was my missing sister, who had been missing for more than 10 years. When she came to look for her, she brought along her birth date. Later, when she did a paternity test, she discovered that she had nothing to do with our family. The director looked up at him and said, Maybe it was a mistake. Yes, we thought so too, Shen Luo said slowly. But this time, Manting got into a car accident and was bedridden for 2 years. When she woke up, she only remembered things before she was 12 years old and believed that her name was He Yinsuan. Then, what about Zhang Meifang? The more the director listened, the more nervous he became. He Junsheng looked at the director and sighed softly. Uncle Director, I just told him that Meifang went missing when she was 14 years old. The director looked at He Junsheng in disbelief. You, He Junsheng lowered his head guiltily. I forgot about that for a moment. I'm sorry. Sigh. The director put down the business card and looked sad. Mr. Shen, I'm sorry. What do you mean? When she was ready to adopt Meifang, she had already gone missing. At that time, she used Meifang's date of birth to look for her. The director looked sad. At that time, the orphanage was poor. She said that if she could find her granddaughter, she would give us 100,000 yuan as a token of appreciation. So you lied to my grandmother? Shen Luo and frowned slightly. Does the date of birth that my grandmother provided match Mei Fang's? The president nodded. That's right. At that time, I was muddle-headed. I wanted the $100,000, and I wanted Yun Cun to live a good life. So I asked Yun Cun to pretend to be Mei Fang and go to your house. As he spoke, he looked at Shen Manting. Shen Manting's eyes were already brimming with tears. What about Mei Fang? I don't know. The director shook his head. She was a young girl at that time. It's normal for her to be kidnapped and sold. After returning from the orphanage, Shen Manting was in low spirits. On his way here, he looked left and right. But when Shen Manting returned, she was speechless. She looked at Shen Luo and asked, Honey, is it possible that Mei Fang is your biological sister? Shen Luo glanced at Shen Manting and nodded. Yes. Does that mean I can't be called Shen Manting anymore? Shen Manting looked at Shen Luo and said, The real Shen Manting is Mei Fang, and I'm a fake. It's just like what they say on TV. We were replaced by a leopard cat. I'm the leopard cat, and Mei Fang is the crown prince. Chapter 2054. I'm not Shen Manting either. Shen Manting was a little disappointed. I'm used to it. You all call me Manting, but Manting is gone. Can I still be Manting? Shen Luo sighed softly and glanced at her sideways. He held the steering wheel with one hand and held her hand with the other. Looking at the road ahead, he said slowly, What are you talking about? No matter who you used to be, or who the real Shen Manting is, you are you now. You are Shen Manting. I'm just here to take a look because I'm a genius. Honey, will you still be my husband in the future? Shen Manting looked at him with a pair of big eyes full of doubt and expectation. Shen Luo's heart fluttered when he suddenly heard this. He turned his head and looked into her dark and clear eyes. He felt a little choked. After a long time, he said softly, As long as you want, we will always be husband and wife. Shen Manting's originally gloomy mood suddenly became joyful. With a smile on her face, she lowered her head and played with the hem of her dress. She said happily, Of course I want to. We will always be husband and wife. Shen Luo looked at her deeply and looked away. There was a dull pain in his chest, and his hands trembled slightly. Looking at the bright sky ahead, he said tentatively and pleadingly, Then let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau tomorrow. Huh? Shen Manting didn't hear clearly. Honey, what did you say? Looking at her clear and innocent eyes, Shen Luo's courage suddenly shrank. His throat was a little dry, and he said, Nothing. It was already afternoon when they returned to the city. Shen Manting was hungry, so he took her out for dinner. It was already 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they returned home. Because Shen Manting woke up, Shen Luo hadn't been to the laboratory for several days. Old Fifth made one call after another. In the end, Shen Luo couldn't win against Lao Wu. He had to leave Shen Manting at home and go out. Before going out, Shen Manting seemed to be a little flustered and called out, Honey. Huh? Shen Luo turned around. What's wrong? When will you be back? At night. Shen Luo rubbed her little head and said softly, I'll try to come back as soon as possible. Oh. Shen Manting looked a little disappointed. Can't you bring me along? Be good and stay at home. It'll be fine. Shen Luo looked a little helpless. You can spend some time with your son. You're his mother. You need to nurture your relationship with him. All right, Shen Manting finally felt a little relieved. She tugged at his clothes reluctantly and said, Then, come back soon. Okay. Shen Luo let go of her hand and turned around. But before he could take 2 steps, he heard another shout from behind, Hubby. He turned around and saw Shen Manting running towards him with a flushed face. Shen Manting stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the lips. I'll wait for you to come back, she said. Shen Luo An's heart was itching. He couldn't help it. He held her head with one hand and kissed her on the lips. His nimble and powerful tongue probed into her mouth and gently pried open her pearly white teeth. It pierced in slightly, tyrannically and greedily rolling her out, holding her tightly to him. His kiss was a little forceful. Enchanting had never experienced such a feeling before. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Chapter 2055. Enchanting's heartbeat quickened, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. Shen Luo couldn't help but push her against the door. Cough, cough. The woman's coughing successfully pulled him back to reality. When he released her, he noticed that her face was completely red. Wiping the water from the corner of his mouth, he lowered his head slightly. Shen Luo An's Adam's apple tightened when he saw her expression. Damn it. His body, which had been empty for 3 years, began to heat up uncontrollably. He looked behind Enchanting and immediately saw Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian looked at him suggestively and said, "Big brother, isn't it a little inconvenient to do this at the doorstep? Why don't we return to our room?" Enchanting's face turned even redder. She turned around and glared at Yi Qianqian shyly. She stomped her feet and said, "You're so mean." Her coquettish voice carried the annoyance and coquettishness of a young girl. Shen Luo An's heart melted as he listened. Yi Qianqian was stunned and subconsciously looked at Enchanting's back. Then, he couldn't help but sigh. It was indeed the consciousness of a little girl. Shen Luo couldn't help but say, "Don't tease her. She's still young." Yi Qianqian replied, "Big brother, it really isn't appropriate to do it at the door." Shen Luo was speechless. He turned around and said, "I'm going to work. Be careful on the road, big brother." Yi Qianqian waved at him. She closed the door and skipped toward her room. Shenjilia was taking an afternoon nap. When he sensed Yi Qianqian enter, he didn't move. He looked up and breathed steadily. Yi Qianqian took off her shoes, lifted the covers, and crawled into bed. She reached over and hugged Shenjilia's waist. She straddled his lap and called out, "Old Shen, get up." Shenjilia didn't open his eyes. He flipped over in her position and hugged her face to face. Yi Qianqian felt a little defeated and continued, "Is it fun to dream?" Shenjilia was speechless. "More fun than me?" Shenjilia opened his eyes and asked, "Do you miss me?" Yi Qianqian's lips curled up, but before she could finish, Shenjilia pounced on her like a wolf. "Ah!" Yi Qianqian screamed with laughter and shouted, "Wait. I have something to say." Shenjilia pinned her under his body and held her firmly between his legs as he said, "I'm going to play with you now." "Wait a minute, I'm just kidding," Yi Qianqian exclaimed. Shenjilia kissed her on the mouth and murmured, "It's too late." "Oh." Yi Qianqian's words were completely swallowed by him. When she was feeling dizzy from the kiss, she pushed his face away and said, "Guess what I just saw?" "What?" Shenjilia was tugging at her clothes, trying his best to pull them off and throw them away. However, after a few tugs, Yi Qianqian refused to cooperate. She frowned and shouted, "Get up for a second." Yi Qianqian arched her back, and Shenjilia finally managed to pull the sweater off. "I saw Big Brother kissing Manting." Yi Qianqian wrapped her arms around his neck. "But Manting is obviously still a child. Doesn't Big Brother feel like he's molesting a child?" Shenjilia's originally serious face couldn't help but burst out laughing. He lifted the blanket up and hugged her exposed head. He pressed his lips against her neck and whispered, "What are you thinking about? Sister Manting is 2 years older than me." "Oh, you didn't see it. She just..." "Oh." Yi Qianqian's words were cut off. Chapter 2056. At first, Yi Qianqian still had the strength to deal with his fierce attacks, but then she completely fell under his passion. Slow down, Shenjilia worked very hard and didn't stop for a moment. When it was almost over, he whispered into her ear, "I want a child." Yi Qianqian narrowed her eyes and hugged him. Her eyes were wet and she whispered, "This is not a reason for you to indulge. Hurry. Get." Shenjilia laughed out loud and kissed her more passionately. Shen Manting originally wanted to ask Yi Qianqian something, but when she walked to the door, she heard faint sounds coming from inside. He didn't deliberately try to cover it up. Even though his voice was pitifully soft through the door, Shen Manting could still hear him clearly as she stood close to the door. For some reason, her hand that was about to knock on the door suddenly stopped. His cheeks began to heat up slightly, and images that made him blush immediately popped up in his mind like a conditioned reflex. She obviously hadn't seen it, but she knew it clearly. Shen Manting withdrew her hand and turned to return to her room. She picked up her phone and after studying it for a while, she finally opened the browser. She saw 2 words, search. She clicked on it, and a keyboard page automatically popped up. She touched it with her finger and poked a few times. She typed, "How to make your husband happy." She clicked on it, and the first line was, 10 little things to make your husband happy. After reading back and forth for a long time, Shen Manting blushed and closed the page. Shen Luo and came back very late that night. It was almost 11 p.m. When he opened the door, the room was dark. There was no doubt that the child had fallen asleep. However, when he walked in and was about to turn on the lights in the room suddenly lit up. Shen Luo and was startled. When he came back to his senses, he saw Shen Manting in her pajamas standing next to the switch. "Husband, you're back." Shen Manting went up to him. "Let me help you take off your coat." Shen Luo and was a little flattered and looked at her. Shen Manting had already reached out to touch his coat and smoothly took off his clothes. Then, she hung up the coat and said, "Sit down for a while. I'll help you run the bath." Shen Luo and looked at her strangely and asked, "What's wrong?" When Shen Manting heard this, her cheeks became a little hot and she said, "I just want to help you run the bath." Then, he walked in. The sound of running water came from the bathroom, and Shen Luo An's heart warmed slightly. Shen Manting walked in and sat beside the bathtub. She stared blankly at the clear hot water flowing down. When he heard the footsteps, he immediately stood up. Shen Luo An stared at her and walked in leisurely. "What's wrong with you today?" When Shen Manting heard his question, she lowered her head in embarrassment and said, "Nothing, I just want to be a good wife." She looked up at him with her clear eyes and said, "Hubby, from today onwards, I'm going to run the bathtub for you every day. I don't know how to make breakfast at work, but I can help you with your tie." As he spoke, the light in his eyes became even more mesmerizing. Shen Luo An stared at the cute little woman in front of him. His heart couldn't help but flutter. "I still have to learn how to make love lunchboxes." "Ah." Shen Manting swallowed her words. She was startled by his sudden embrace. "What? What's wrong?" Shen Luo An hugged her tightly. Shen Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she actually felt that. He was afraid, but wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Chapter 2057. Shen Luo An hugged her tightly. Shen Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that. He was afraid, but wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Shen Manting didn't understand. She hugged the man and whispered, "Honey." The room was silent. There was only the sound of the bathtub running water in the bathroom. Shen Luo An hugged her and whispered, "Manting, I love you." His voice was very low, and there was an almost inaudible quiver in it. Shen Manting was slightly stunned when she heard this. She should be happy. But she didn't know why she felt a little sad. She felt that Shen Luo An was hugging her tighter. She groaned and whispered, "Honey, you're too tight. I'm uncomfortable." Shen Luo An released her slightly when he heard this. Shen Manting noticed that Shen Luo An's eyes were a little red. Her heart ached and she felt a little sad. Shenmanting pouted and looked at Shenluo. Honey, what's wrong with you today? It's nothing. Shenluo combed her hair behind her ear and whispered, I'm very happy. Shenmanting saw the slight smile on his lips and felt a little better. Well, as long as you're happy. I'll do this for you every day in the future. Shenmanting smiled and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. I love you too. After saying this, she felt a little sweet in her heart. With a smile on his lips, he quickly ran out. She held the door handle and looked at him deeply when she was about to close it. After a moment, she turned around and her heart was beating fast. I'm in love, Shenmanting said to herself. Her face was hot and her mood was high. Shenluo stood in the bathroom for a long time before he turned to look at the bathtub. The water was running fast and it was almost full. I just want to be a good wife. Her simple and shy words made Shenluo's heart beat faster. How nice. When he came out of the shower, Shenmanting was already asleep. He gently lifted the quilt and got into bed. Shenluo gently wrapped his arm around her waist. Shenmanting sensed his arrival and snuggled into his arms. She breathed heavily in his arms, relying on him and greedily. Shenluo smiled and quickly closed his eyes. The baby woke up early the next morning. A childish voice called out in a childish voice, Daddy. Shenluo woke up immediately. Shen Yueshao was standing on the child's bed, leaning against the railing and looking at him pitifully. Shenluo subconsciously glanced at Shenmanting. She was still asleep, but he didn't know what she was dreaming about. There was a faint smile on her lips. Shenluo stood up quietly, picked up his son, and walked inside. After her son was done peeing, she helped the little boy brush his teeth, wash his face, and change his clothes. Shenmanting slowly woke up after everything was done. When he stood up, he was shocked to find that the father and son were already neatly dressed. Looking at the time, it was already 7:30. She quickly got up and said, Hubby, I woke up late. Why didn't you wake me up? Nothing much. Go back to sleep if you're tired. Shenluo walked over with the baby in his arms. Call me Mommy. Mommy. The little boy reached out to Shenmanting. Give me a hug. Shenmanting hugged him and said regretfully, I wanted to help you shave and tie your tie, but I can't do that today. Shenluo's gaze softened. He held her chin and kissed her on the lips. Chapter 2058. Shenmanting's cheeks were pink, and she shrank back. When Shenluo saw her like this, he couldn't help but lean forward and say, I don't mind. Shenmanting's face turned even redder. I mind. Then she glanced at Shenluo and the child and said, I'm going to brush my teeth. After getting out of bed, Shenmanting hurried into the bathroom. She touched her face. It was burning hot. My husband is so dirty. I didn't even brush my teeth, and he kissed me just like that. Shenmanting looked at herself in the mirror and took a whiff of her breath. It seems okay. After washing up, Shenmanting walked out and saw Shenjilia playing with a tablet with the little boy in his arms. Do you know what this is? Shenjilia whispered and pointed to a watermelon. Tell me. Shen Yueshao looked at it for a long time, then pointed to it and said, Eat. Shenjilia smiled and rubbed his head, saying, You know it's eat. You're smart. What about this? Mom. Xiao Yu called out. He was very excited to see Shenmanting. He struggled to get down from Shenjilia's lap and shouted, Mommy. Shenjilia put him down and sighed, This little boy doesn't want me now that he has a mother. Little ingrate. Little Moon ran over and hugged Shenmanting with a smile. He jumped up and down and shouted, Mommy. Shenmanting picked up the little boy and was in a good mood. She looked at Shenjilia and asked, Where's my husband? Well. Shenjilia was still very unfamiliar with the way Shenmanting addressed him. He lowered his head and touched his nose, saying, "He just went out. He should be in the garden." "Okay, thank you." Enchanting walked out with little Moon in her arms, looking very motherly. Shenjilia looked at her back and said with a sigh, "You've really changed." "Right, I wasn't wrong, right?" When Enchanting came out, she heard Shenjilia's voice. She reached out and pulled him up to sit down, saying, "My father doesn't seem to be in good health recently. I called him, but he was either sleeping or coughing. I asked him what happened, but he didn't tell me. Old Shen, let's go back to Yuntown to see him." "Sure." Shenjilia looked at her. "I'll drop by Kingstown on the way to see Lily's children." "Humph," Yi Qianqian gave him a look of disdain. "You never forget to take care of the children wherever you go." Shenjilia stood up and gently nudged her shoulder with his. He winked at her and said, "I like it." His feminine voice gave Yi Qianqian goosebumps. He rubbed his arms and hurriedly walked to the dining table. "Let's go tomorrow. I'm worried that Dad might get sick. You should ask for leave from the hospital." "So urgent?" Shenjilia picked up his phone. "All right, let's go. Tomorrow is Saturday. Come back on Wednesday." Yi Qianqian looked at him and smiled brightly. "Okay." How could Shenjilia refuse? With a chuckle, he replied, "All right." When Enchanting walked out with the baby in her arms, Shenluo and was indeed standing in the garden. He seemed to be pulling out weeds for an unknown plant. His movements were slow and elegant, and he looked like he was taking his time. "Daddy!" Little Moon was already one step ahead of her and shouted. He swung his legs in Enchanting's arms. The little boy wasn't heavy, but he was still quite strong. Enchanting couldn't carry him anymore. She loosened her grip and bent down to put him down. Chapter 2059. Enchanting couldn't help but rub her sore hands. Shenluo saw it and stood up, patted the dust off his hands, and asked, "What's wrong?" "My hands are sore." Enchanting rubbed her arms and glanced at Little Moon, who was squatting on the ground to pull weeds. "The little guy is quite heavy. Don't hold him for too long in the future." Shenluo patted the dust off his hands, reached out to hold her arm, and slowly rubbed it for her. "Your hand was injured, and it may be very uncomfortable if it bears heavy weights for too long." "Oh." Enchanting bit her lip and chuckled. "I know. Let's go and take our son back for breakfast." "I want to go for a walk." Enchanting looked at him. "Honey, take me for a walk. I haven't been around here much." In the past few days, Shenluo had driven her out. However, she had never been out of the neighborhood. Occasionally, she felt that the neighborhood was very familiar, but it was indeed very strange. Hearing Enchanting's request, Shenluo glanced at her, and his heart was slightly moved. Take a walk in the neighborhood. If they walked in the neighborhood, they would inevitably pass by the small park and the basketball court. Enchanting's desperate hysteria on that night 2 years ago still seemed to echo in his ears. He would never forget that look for the rest of his life. In the face of her expectant and longing gaze, Shenluo was a little afraid to look at it. Soon, he looked away. He looked at his son, who was squatting on the ground and playing with weeds, and said slowly, "Let's have breakfast first. There's nothing to see around here." "Oh." Enchanting looked a little disappointed. "Then let's go in first." Shenluo didn't dare to look at her and responded in a low voice. When it was time for breakfast, Shenjilia and Yi Qianqian were almost done. Shenjilia stood up, and before he left, he suddenly remembered something and said, "Brother, I'm going back to Yuntown with Qianqian tomorrow. Don't go to the laboratory for the next 2 days. Stay at home with the child and sister-in-law." Sister-in-law. These 2 words came out of Shenjilia's mouth, and it was indescribably pleasing to the ear. She couldn't help but glance at him and say, "Got it. You can go. You haven't been taking care of my child for long, so don't take credit here." "Hey," Shenjilia wiped the corner of his mouth and said with a look of helplessness and disdain, You're burning the bridge after crossing the river. Before sister-in-law woke up, Qianqian, Dad, and I took care of him together. You're always running around in the laboratory, and little you, almost doesn't recognize his father anymore. Little Moon raised his head when he heard his name being called. He looked at Shenjilia and then at Shenluo, and her little hand was holding a plastic spoon, and she was chewing on the porridge. Shenjilia looked at him and clicked his tongue. Look at your table manners. Look at how you're eating. Little Moon ignored him and lowered his head to continue eating. That's enough. Let's go. Shenluo and couldn't stand it anymore. You're affecting my son's meal by standing here. Shenjilia replied, You're heartless. He left quickly. When Shenjilia entered the room, Yi Qianqian was packing her clothes. When she saw Shenjilia come in, Yi Qianqian didn't even look up and said, It shouldn't be too cold in Yuntown. Oh, by the way, Tong Tong is getting married next month. She wants us to go together. No, Shenjilia said without hesitation. What does her marriage have to do with me? Chapter 2060. We're friends, after all. Why don't we go when we get married? Yi Qianqian glanced at him. You're a man. Why are you so petty? I'm not going. Shenjilia looked as if there was no room for negotiation. But who is she married? Oh, her colleague in the company. He looks quite honest. You've met him? I've seen his picture. Yi Qianqian folded the clothes and put them in her suitcase. I think he's pretty good. Tisk, that's why I say you women only know how to bully honest people. What did honest people do? Yi Qianqian said. Tong Tong is also very honest. Other than her current husband, she hasn't had a boyfriend. Shenjilia didn't say anything and helped her fold the clothes. What time is it? Aren't you going to work? Yi Qianqian glanced at the time. Buddy, it's 8:30. Shenjilia placed the folded clothes on the bed and leaned over. Kiss me. Yi Qianqian replied, No. Kiss me. No. Yi Qianqian turned her head away in disgust and stuffed the folded clothes into her suitcase. Shenjilia leaned forward. Then I'll kiss you. As he said this, he leaned over and pinched her chin. Yi Qianqian's face was straightened, and she was kissed. Yi Qianqian's face was squeezed out of shape. She turned her head away, but Shenjilia picked her up and threw her on the bed. Shenjilia pressed his body down and held her hands in place as he kissed her. Let's go. Yi Qianqian was still firmly trapped. After struggling for a while, she simply gave up. When Shenjilia was in the mood for kissing, he opened his mouth and bit her. Ouch! Shenjilia didn't let go. He pulled away and said, Are you really going to bite me? Yi Qianqian didn't feel guilty when she saw him like this. She shouted, Hurry up and go to work. How dare you bite me? Shenjilia clenched his teeth. With a fierce look on his face, he rubbed his hands together and looked like a hooligan. He touched her waist and shouted, I'm not going to work. Ah! Yi Qianqian screamed, but with a smile. Go away, you pervert. You're committing adultery in broad daylight. So be it. Shenjilia lifted her clothes. I'm coming. Yi Qianqian hugged his head and laughed. In ancient times, you would be drowned in a pig cage. Shenjilia responded with a groan. He opened his mouth and sucked on her soft, snow-white lips. However, just as he was about to eat, he heard a clear knock on the door. Both Shenjilia and Yi Qianqian froze and turned their heads to look. The white door was ajar, and the knocking continued. Shenluo An's voice could be heard. Can you close the door a little? There are children inside. Yi Qianqian's face suddenly turned red. He kicked Shenjilia away and said, Be ****, how dare you not close the door? Shenjilia couldn't remember whether he had closed the door or not. After being kicked, his anger subsided a little. He straightened his clothes and got out of bed. Shen Luo and stood nearby, and Shen Manting's face was already flushed. Shen Jilie was a little embarrassed. He coughed lightly, and his cheeks were a little hot. He said awkwardly, I was just joking. I'm about to go to work. Shen Luo and glanced at him. You could have left a long time ago. You're a bad influence on children. Jilie and sister-in-law are still children at heart. We've grown up and are adults. We can't be compared to them. Shen Luo and noticed that her eyes had turned red. Shen Manting looked as if something extremely heartbreaking had happened to her, and soon, big drops of tears fell from her eyes. Jilie likes Qianqian, so he plays with her. You don't play with me because you don't like me, right? Shen Manting sobbed. You don't like me at all, do you? Her simple and innocent words silenced Shen Luo and. After reading it, you can go and read the new book. It's also free. The cute, handsome, and tough male lead, Big Lock. You won't be disappointed after reading it. It's so good. Chapter 2062. How could he not like her? It was precisely because he liked her so much that he was worried about her gains and losses. It was precisely because he loved her so much that he was afraid. Shen Luo An's chest ached, and the burning desire in his body subsided a little. The door of the room was open. Nanny he heard the movement inside and came over to take a look. She was a little worried. But soon, she turned around and carried the child. Shen Luo and clearly sensed the movement behind him. He looked at Shen Manting in front of him and sighed softly. He walked up to her and gently held her in his arms. Shen Manting sniffled, raised her hand to wipe her face, and hugged Shen Luo and tightly. Manting. Shen Luo An's voice sounded a little drawn out, with a soft sigh. When Shen Manting heard his voice and felt the clear warmth in front of her, her tears stopped. She buried her cheek in his arms and answered in a nasal voice, hubby. It was a greeting in 2 words. Shen Luo and had heard it for several days, but he was still not used to it. He was very happy to hear such an affectionate greeting, which he had longed for a long time, come out of her mouth. Shen Luo and was a little greedy as he gently kissed her hair. Shen Manting was tickled by his kiss. It was a little comfortable, but also a little uncomfortable. She couldn't describe the feeling and subconsciously avoided it. Shen Luo and quickly released her and said softly, I'm a little busy today. I have to go to the laboratory. You and the baby should be good at home. Shen Manting couldn't describe the feeling in her heart. It was a little sour and a little sad. However, his explanation made her feel a little less angry. Shen Manting nodded and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently on the lips. She said softly, come back soon. Shen Luo and was moved, and his heart was even more shaken. He looked at her deeply and only said one word, okay. Shen Manting looked into his eyes and felt that there seemed to be endless information in them. She couldn't understand it. But she could tell that he didn't dislike her. He liked her. Realizing this, Shen Manting smiled through her tears. She glanced at his clothes and said, hubby, I learned how to tie a tie yesterday. Shall I tie a tie for you? Huh? Shen Luo and was a little surprised. Who did you learn it from? There's a TV on the phone. I learned from the TV on the phone. As Shen Manting spoke, she walked inside and found a man's tie that had been left unused in the cloakroom for a long time. The light red and dark red checkered tie looked very exquisite and formal. Shen Luo and was wearing very simple clothes. He didn't usually need to wear such formal clothes when he went to the laboratory. But when he saw her pick up her tie, he couldn't help but look forward to it. Looking at her expectant smile and her sparkling big eyes, he couldn't help but smile. He stroked her head and said, then I'll go change my clothes. Shen Luo and walked into the cloakroom. As soon as he took off his coat, he saw Shen Manting looking at him with a burning gaze. The fire that had just calmed down was once again easily ignited by her at this moment. His throat tightened, and he closed the door uneasily. When he came out, he had already changed into a formal suit. Chapter 2063. Am I handsome? Shen Luo and glanced at his attire and smiled. It's not easy to hear a compliment from you. He. Shen Manting's eyes sparkled. She tightened her tie and said, if you like it, I'll praise you every day. As he spoke, he hopped forward and said, I'll help you with your tie. She was in high spirits. She stood on her tiptoes and put the tie around his neck. Shen Luo and had never experienced such a feeling. This feeling of being treasured by her, desired by her, fawned over by her. His heart was filled with warmth as he stared at her fixedly with a pair of eyes. Shen Manting's face was flushed as she concentrated on helping him tie his tie. Like this. Shen Manting muttered to herself as she twirled the tie around, but it didn't seem right no matter how hard she tried. How can it be wrong? That's exactly what the TV said. She scratched her head, but when she looked up, she saw that Shen Luo and was looking at her. She didn't know when it started, but that gaze seemed to want to knead her deeply. Shen Manting blushed and said, I forgot how to do it. It's okay. Shen Luo and looked at her. Take your time. Shen Manting nodded and continued to work. However, his unwavering determination just now had been defeated. Shen Manting felt her face getting hotter and hotter, and her movements became slower and slower. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She stomped her feet and said, Aya, don't keep looking at me. I was so nervous that I didn't know what to do. Shen Luo and chuckled and looked away. Then I won't look at you. Shen Manting didn't believe him and quietly lifted her eyes to peek at him. She realized that Shen Luo and was really not looking at her anymore. It was as if he did not care at all. This feeling made Shen Manting even more unhappy. He flung his necktie and said, Forget it, I can't handle it. Shen Luo and couldn't help but laugh. His heart was surrounded by a thick and sweet feeling. Looking at her little face, which was full of excitement just a moment ago, suddenly looking like a frosted eggplant, he actually felt very satisfied. He couldn't help but hug her. His actions were a little sudden. Shen Manting was shocked and froze. She looked at the frightened expression on his face. Manting. Shen Luo and embraced her and called out softly, Manting. Ah. Shen Manting looked at him timidly and shrank back. She was a little uncertain and asked, Hubby, are you stupid? The smile on Shen Luo An's face widened. He pinched her chin with his palm and swallowed her sweetness. Shen Manting only felt that it was a little sudden, but very quickly, her body seemed to have turned into a pool of spring water, indescribably soft. Shen Luo and gradually moved deeper and deeper, sweeping her out to be with him. His kiss, very deep, very heavy. It was deeper and more dizzying than the last time. Shen Manting's hands unconsciously climbed onto his shoulders, and her whole body seemed to have lost all its strength as she hung onto his body. His body was getting closer and closer. Shen Manting could clearly feel his desire and passion. Between her waist and abdomen, a burning hot unknown object was pressing against her. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling that made her a little uncomfortable. Shen Manting was a little curious. She put her hand down and touched it tentatively. In an instant, Shen Luo An's entire body tensed up. Chapter 2064. Shen Luo An's eyes were as deep as the sea, dark and bottomless. Shen Manting vaguely felt a sense of danger, and the sense of danger made her look forward to it. Shen Luo An's tender hands were still resting on the bed, and he was so stiff that he was close to going crazy. Manting. Shen Luo An's voice was low and husky. He pressed against her, and the deep desire in his voice moved her. Honey. Shen Manting suddenly felt a little scared, and she only felt that her palms were getting hotter and hotter. She quickly withdrew her hands, but she heard Shen Luo and say in a low voice, "Don't move." Shen Manting was shocked, and she didn't dare to move. At the same time, she looked at him in confusion and asked timidly, "What?" When Shen Luo and saw her like this, he immediately felt an inexplicable sense of guilt. His originally tense body became more and more uncomfortable. Shen Luo and closed his eyes, put her down, and said hoarsely, "Nothing." When Shen Manting saw that he was about to leave, she felt a little empty in her heart. She held his hand and said, "Honey." Shen Luo and was even more angry, and he suppressed the most primitive desire in his heart and looked at her. The lights in the cloakroom were not turned on. Compared to the outside, the light inside was very dim. Shen Manting's eyes seemed to be shining, and she looked at him, pulled his hand, and said, "You just kissed me so happily." Boom! Her words were like the blazing sun that was shot out of the darkness. In an instant, the light around them suddenly burst, and Shen Luo and was even more unable to control himself. He held her hand and pulled her into his arms. Even Shen Luo and himself didn't know what he was going to do. It was completely a subconscious action, and when he came to himself, Shen Manting was already in his arms. Shen Manting looked up at Shen Luo and her pair of big eyes were full of doubt. Looking at Shen Luo and she said softly, "Honey, you look so different today." Shen Luo An's throat was even more tight, and he asked hoarsely, "What's different?" "What's different?" Shen Manting couldn't say it, and facing Shen Luo An's burning gaze, her cheeks became even hotter, and she said, "It's different. Everything is different." But when he looked down, he saw the protruding bulge. She couldn't help but reach out and poke him. Shen Luo An, who was above her, immediately drew in a sharp breath. "Don't move." Shen Luo An's voice was low and hoarse. He seemed to be enduring it. "Don't move." Shen Manting was a little shocked. She quickly withdrew her hand and asked, "Dear, are you feeling unwell? Uncomfortable?" How could he be comfortable when he was already like this? Shen Luo and blushed and pressed her hand down. Shen Manting only felt a burning sensation on her skin. She looked up at him in confusion. "If I'm not feeling well, can you help me?" "Of course." Shen Manting looked at him. "I'll go get the medicine from Nanny He." As he spoke, he struggled to get up. But before she could move, Shen Luo and pulled her back. "You're my medicine." Shen Manting was stunned and looked at him. Then, she said with some fear, "Hubby, are you going to eat me?" Shen Luo An's expression deepened. "Can I?" His voice was low and hoarse, and he asked with desire. Shen Manting looked at him and shrank back. She said, I heard that eating human flesh is not good for the body, and it's sour." Chapter 2065. She shrunk back and forth in Shen Luo An's arms. Shen Luo An couldn't help laughing when he saw her cute and scared look. "What if I have to eat you?" Shen Luo An looked at her, pressed her against the door, and rubbed her gently. "I won't feel uncomfortable after eating you." Shen Manting was slightly stunned, and her whole body was hot. She blushed even more, looked away, and said nervously and fearfully, "Then, if you will feel better after eating me, then you eat me." As she said that, she rolled up her sleeves with trembling hands and stretched out her white and tender hands in front of Shen Luo An. "Bite me. If I'm still alive, remember to send me to the hospital." Although she said that, Shen Manting's eyes were already red. She looked at him with a pleading look. Obviously, she was very scared. Shen Luo An laughed even louder, lifted her up, and lifted her clothes with his palm. "Hubby." Shen Manting was a little scared and wanted to hold him down, but she couldn't stop him at all. Shen Luo An's hand had already reached into her clothes and pinched her lovely white and tender hands. A strange feeling arose from that place. Shen Manting couldn't help but scream, "Hubby." Shen Luo An didn't make a sound, and he lowered his head to take all her words into his mouth. He gently licked and kissed her, and heavily teased her. Oh. Enchanting couldn't help but breathe heavily because of his familiar movements. Hearing her voice, Enchanting couldn't help but lower his head and bite her white and erect breasts. He ravaged and sucked, and Enchanting felt like she was bitten by ants all over, and it was extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't help but make a strange sound, but it was just a sound, and Enchanting quickly covered her mouth. But her body was still being teased, and the strange and turbulent feeling crushed what little was left of her rationality. She couldn't help but squint her eyes and hold his head with both hands. She clasped her legs around his, and even her toes curled up. She felt uncomfortable all over, but it seemed quite comfortable. Daddy. A childish voice suddenly broke in. The world that had been surging with dark waves was like a mirror that had been shattered by a single punch. Enchanting's movements immediately froze, and Enchanting breathed a sigh of relief. When Enchanting realized that she had been put down, she hurriedly tugged at her clothes. His face had already turned red, and his body was burning hot. Enchanting stumbled out of the room in a hurry. When she saw her son enter the room, she picked up the infant and sat on the bed. His heart was still beating fast, and he could not help but look at the cloakroom. Enchanting walked out from inside. His clothes were disheveled, and the tie around his neck was crooked. Enchanting couldn't help but take a second look at his tall figure. Enchanting didn't linger and quickly entered the bathroom. She heard the sound of water splashing, and she found it a little strange. Bathing at this time? Aren't you going to work? Just as he was feeling puzzled, Nanny he entered the room. The moment Nanny he saw Enchanting's swollen lips and messy clothes, as well as the sound of running water in the bathroom, she knew what had happened. She hurried forward and held the little boy's hand. Let's go. Grandma made you something to eat. I'll feed you, Nanny he said. Pouted unhappily and turned around to hug Enchanting. I don't want to eat, Mommy. Chapter 2066. She stood up with the baby in her arms and said, I'll go feed him. What did you make? Her cheeks were a little red, and she looked very shy. Nanny he looked at her with an ambiguous expression and said, I made some colorful noodles with vegetable powder. It's very nutritious. Okay. Enchanting walked out, and Enchanting walked out at the same time. Enchanting. Enchanting looked at Enchanting and said, You're out. Enchanting blinked. She felt a little uncomfortable being called that. Especially when she thought of what had happened just now, she felt even more embarrassed. Enchanting nodded and forced herself to calm down. What's wrong? Nothing. Enchanting was a little hesitant, but she quickly said, Are you going out later? No. Enchanting felt that she wanted to say something but stopped. Do you have something to say? Well, I have something to ask you. Let's go out for a walk later. Enchanting smiled. I have a lot to ask you. Okay. Enchanting agreed. Looking at her expectant look, she felt a little strange. Call me later. Okay. Enchanting sat on the sofa and fed the baby. Little Moon ate happily while twisting the little toy in his hand. He suddenly looked up and mumbled with his mouth full, Daddy. Enchanting was still in the same outfit, but he didn't wear his tie. When he heard the little boys shout, he went forward and rubbed his head. He said to someone, I'm going to work. Wait for me to come back. He was looking at the little boy, but Enchanting knew that he was talking to her. She nodded and replied softly, Okay. Enchanting left quickly. Enchanting stared at his back, her heart filled with satisfaction. She felt even more embarrassed when she thought of Enchanting's intimate actions just now. She also felt strange in her body. It was very strange. Enchanting didn't know what this feeling was, but it seemed that she liked it. Enchanting left quickly. Enchanting was a little absent-minded as she fed the baby. Nanny he noticed and said, If you have something to do, go ahead. I'll feed the baby. There's no need for that. Nanny you can go about your business. I'll do it. Enchanting insisted. After feeding the baby, she took him to play in the garden. Looking at little Moon bouncing up and down, Enchanting felt the happiness of a mother. That's great. Enchanting's voice came from behind. In the blink of an eye, the child has grown up so much. Enchanting looked at the little boy and turned to look at Enchanting. I really envy you. Why are you envious of me? Enchanting looked at her in confusion. I'm envious of you. I think you're pretty and sensible. Julia seems to like you very much. Enchanting couldn't help but take another look at her and said, You've indeed changed. Manting, it's better for you to stay like this. Is that so? Enchanting was a little embarrassed. My husband seems to think so too. Did he say anything to you? Enchanting shook her head. He didn't say anything, but I could feel that he was thinking the same thing. Chapter 2067. Enchanting thought about it and explained, Actually, it's not that I don't like you. I just like the way you are right now. You look happy every day. You don't remember anything, so you don't feel any pain. It's pretty good. Was it painful for me before? Enchanting was a little puzzled. I feel like I'm the one who's in pain now that I don't know anything. Hubby always calls me Manting, but I don't feel happy at all. I feel so sad. After all, she was a 12-year-old girl and didn't know how to hide her emotions at all. Enchanting looked at her pouting face and turned her head away. She seemed to be sighing with emotion as she said meaningfully, He loves you. I know, Enchanting replied with a smile on her face. However, within a few seconds, her smile disappeared and she said, But he won't play with me. Enchanting was speechless. Looking at Enchanting's angry face, she didn't seem to be joking. It was at that moment that Enchanting once again realized that this was a 12-year-old girl. Enchanting thought for a moment and explained, Perhaps Big Brother is busy. She glanced at Enchanting's expression and deliberated over her choice of words before saying, Moreover, he's more mature and steady. Normally. I don't think he'll play much. The more Enchanting thought about it, the more convinced she became. She finally made up her mind and nodded her head. He's always been so serious. Don't mind him too much. But, why can Julia play with you? Enchanting was puzzled. Enchanting was surprised. Huh? You had so much fun this morning. Enchanting looked at him enviously and said, My husband never plays with me. I want to play too. Enchanting was speechless. She thought Enchanting was talking about the game of Eagle Catches Chicks or hide and seek. Hearing this, he coughed lightly and said, Well, what we did this morning can't be considered as playing. Huh? Enchanting was a little confused. But you're smiling so happily. Aren't you playing? Enchanting felt a little embarrassed and replied, Well, not really. Besides, I'm not that happy either. Yes. Enchanting was very certain. You're so happy. Enchanting replied, Well, be happy then. Humph. You're still trying to deceive me. Enchanting looked as if she had already seen through him. Enchanting felt even more embarrassed. When she saw Enchanting's expression, she explained in all seriousness, I didn't. We weren't actually playing. To be exact, we were flirting. Enchanting's eyes widened when she heard that word. Flirt? She looked as if Enchanting had said something unbelievable. Enchanting suddenly felt guilty for lying to a little girl. When she saw the expression on Enchanting's face, she turned her head away and said, Yeah. We're husband and wife. It's normal for us to flirt and play around, then why doesn't my husband flirt with me? Enchanting replied, I can't answer your question. Why? Enchanting was puzzled. Enchanting was silent for a moment before she said, How about this? When Big Brother comes home at night, you can ask him. You can say, honey, why aren't you flirting with me? Look at the people next door, they're all flirting. Chapter 2068. Yi Qianqian said. That's not the point. The point is that you have to ask him. You shouldn't be asking me this kind of question. Oh, okay. Shen Manting nodded quickly. I understand. I'll ask him tonight why he didn't flirt with me. Yi Qianqian finally raised her head in relief and said, very good, but don't tell him that I taught you. It'll be troublesome if you say that I'm a bad influence on a child. Shen Manting looked at her with a smile and said, you're the child. I'm taller than you. You're more like a child than me. Yi Qianqian was a little confused. She sighed softly and said, I shouldn't have told you so much. She seemed to have been a bad influence on her. Shen Manting's temperament, the way she spoke, and the expression in her eyes didn't seem like that of a normal adult. Although she was not mentally retarded, Yi Qianqian could no longer treat her as a peer. Shen Manting looked at her and asked, how long have you been married to Jilia? 2 years. Yi Qianqian glanced at Little Moon, who was playing with the grass on the ground. I got married to old Shen the year Big Brother brought him back. Then, when did my husband and I get married? Shen Manting looked at her and said, I think it's been a long time, but it doesn't seem that long. Shen Manting suddenly felt a little childish when she said that. She coughed and said with a straight face, that's right. I'm just curious. You're married and you have a ring on your finger. Shen Manting glanced at Yi Qianqian's hand. On the ring finger of her left hand, there was a very shiny and beautiful diamond ring. After a moment, she looked at her somewhat thin hand. Her skin was a little yellow, and it didn't look as good as Yi Qianqian's hand at all. And I don't have a ring on my finger. Yi Qianqian subconsciously hid her hand when she heard that. Her eyes were a little evasive. She looked into the distance and suddenly felt a little guilty. Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I have a ring? Because Shen Manting and Shen Luo and were not married at all. Shen Manting was not willing to wear Shen Luo An's ring at all. However, even though she knew that, how could she bring it up to Shen Manting? It was difficult to speak at all. He glanced at Shen Manting, coughed softly, and said, maybe it's because you've slept for too long. Look at your hand. It's so skinny. How can you wear a ring? Yes, yes. Shen Manting felt inexplicably happy when she heard his answer. That's what I thought too. Actually, I saw a ring in the shape of a heart with many diamonds. It was placed under the blanket, but it was too big for me, so I put it back. Shen Manting spoke with a hint of boastfulness in her voice. It's very beautiful. As Yi Qianqian watched, she found it amusing and sad at the same time. She nodded her head and reached out to hold Yi Qianqian's hand. In a soft voice, she said, it's good that you like him. Big Brother actually likes you very much. He loves you very much. As long as you believe in him with all your heart, he won't let you down. Shen Manting felt a little puzzled and didn't quite understand what she meant. She nodded and said, yes, I know he loves me very much. I can feel it. No one has ever treated me like this before. I love him very much, too. Yes, I know he loves me very much. I can feel it. No one has ever treated me like this before. Chapter 2069. Huh? Yi Qianqian's eyes widened and she was a little confused. What did you just say? Shen Manting thought that she hadn't made herself clear, so she repeated, can you teach me how to seduce men? Yi Qianqian wanted to laugh, but when she saw Shen Manting's serious expression, she couldn't laugh. She coughed lightly. Actually, I don't know how to do that. As long as a man likes you, you don't have to seduce him. He will come over himself. If he doesn't like you, no matter how you seduce him, it's useless. These words were the truth of the world. When Yi Qianqian said this, she saw that Shen Manting had a look of understanding on her face. Then, do I still have to seduce my husband? Enchanting looked a little defeated. I think my husband likes me, but sometimes I feel that he doesn't like me that much. Yesterday, I used my phone to check it out and tried to imitate what's written on it, but I realized that it didn't work. What things? Prepare the bathwater for my husband, shave, tie his tie, and give him a good morning kiss. Wow, Enchanting was a little surprised. You did all that? A little, tisk, tisk. Enchanting laughed even more. She didn't know how she felt, but she said, I've never done those things that you mentioned. Moreover, Enchanting had always been the one who prepared the bathwater for her. Well. In all fairness, Enchanting was really good to her. Although he had been a little demanding in some aspects recently, at least he was wholeheartedly devoted to her. Enchanting felt a little embarrassed, and her cheeks turned slightly red. She said, Oh, it's my first time being someone else's wife. I don't know what to do. As she said this, she pouted and said, Enchanting, teach me what I should do. Otherwise, I don't know what to do to be a wife. It's very simple. You just have to take care of the child. Enchanting shrugged. The child is still young. You have to take care of the child and let him worry less. That's a good wife. Oh. Enchanting nodded and couldn't help but ask curiously, since you don't have children, what do you usually do when you have nothing to do? Enchanting replied. Give birth. Oh. Enchanting looked at her belly and asked, Are you going to have a baby? Enchanting rubbed her belly and smiled bitterly. I'll give birth once I'm pregnant. The key was that she couldn't get pregnant. In the past 2 years, they had not taken any safety measures. She just couldn't get pregnant. This year, she was already 28 years old. If she delayed any longer, she might become an elderly pregnant woman. Moreover, if Grandma and Uncle Blind were right, this year, it was very likely that she could get pregnant. She looked at Little Moon, who was having a great time playing by himself. She felt a twinge of jealousy in her heart and said longingly, That's why I'm so envious of you. You don't know anything when you wake up. You've forgotten all the unhappy things. You even have a cute baby and a man who loves you. Enchanting sensed that she seemed to be a little sad, so she cautiously said, You have it too. You have to continue living happily. When Enchanting saw the look on her face, a bright smile appeared on her face and she nodded her head. Yeah. Enchanting came home very early that day, and he seemed to be in a good mood. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.